So, this is episode 2 of the Listening Project. And the Listening Project is a project I've started to interview men, women, professionals, anyone who has a view or a perspective or a lived experience around men's mental health, male suicide. Um, the stats are shocking that suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. It's not cancer, it's not car accidents, it's men choosing to end their own life. And the way I like to think about it is that if there's a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum, we've got men choosing to end their own life, and at the other end of the spectrum, we've got men feeling fully alive, on purpose, waking up, ready and excited for life, just really like feeling at home on planet Earth and like their life means something and just have a zest for life. Um, how many men might be at the end of the spectrum where they're not choosing to end their life, but they are, waking up with a struggle, going through the motions, not able to speak about what they're moving through, what they're feeling, feeling lonely, feeling disconnected from themselves, from their body, from their emotions, um, and just not living a fulfilled life. So I'm curious to speak to men at all ends of the spectrum. I'm curious to speak to women who have a view, who live with, witness, observe men. And I think there's so much we can learn from women. The other stat is that 75% of suicides are men. So there's obviously something where women are meeting themselves more deeply than men. I think there's a lot we can learn. So yeah, very keen to speak to women, professionals, people who've lost people, men to suicide, men in their lives. So yes, that's just an introduction of the project. And what I plan to do with this is fall in love with the problem. So the problem is men are ending their own lives at a rate that is an epidemic, you know. And I don't plan to form a solution in my head, like what could the solution be? And obviously, this is a societal problem, it's a systemic problem, it's much bigger than I alone can solve. I don't claim to have the answer, but I know that if I allow the interviews I'm having with people and I gather the insight and I allow that to just dictate what the next step is. Take my ego out of it, take any ideas. Obviously, I've got quite a lot of experience from the last few years being in men's circles around spaces with men, men's retreats, was a men's coach for 6 months. So I've got quite a experience, including my own experience. Um, from watching Kieran in the last sort of 12 months of his life, and even since lockdown, Kieran was having his challenges. He did attempt suicide during lockdown. He attempted suicide in the July before he actually ended his life in the September last year. So I feel like I do have experience in this area. Um, and I think I am, well, actually, I feel a lot of imposter syndrome. I feel like I'm not experienced. I feel like, in a lot of ways, that I had all the experience in 2024, and yet my own brother, Kieran, still ended his life. And that, there's a lot of humility in that. There's a lot of, like, when I qualified as a coach, I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I knew how to help men. And yet, my own brother went through his own struggles and wasn't able to reach out to me. And that is something I need to live with. And it gives me a great sense of humility that, yeah, that I just want to listen. I don't want to claim to have the answers. I just want to listen. And I've put my first interview in this week, which I'm really excited for on Thursday. Uh, yeah, and I feel like that's all I need to do now. Just speak to people, and allow that to decide what the next step is. I don't want to have any way of dictating or forcing or, yeah, creating an outcome that I want. I want to speak to people and take my ego out of this. And I feel very clear on that. And just to mention that imposter syndrome, that's something I've really been struggling with, um like, who am I to speak to people about male suicide? Who am I to do this project? And yeah, I had a really helpful conversation sorry, with my coach, Joel, last week. And he asked me a question. It was like, if not you, then who? Who will really go into this problem? And I know many people are. There's great charities. There's Calm, that are the mental health charity that I raised money for in 2023. There's someone I follow on Instagram who's got funding from Glasgow University to research male suicide. So there are people doing amazing work out there, and I just want to create this project as my offering, to this collective challenge we've got, to this societal problem we've got. Because the way I see it is that men committing suicide causes absolute devastation to their families, to their communities. And not only men on this end of the spectrum committing suicide, but men living, further up the spectrum, living disconnected lives, not connected to themselves, not fully connected to their community, to their family, living lives of quiet desperation. Like, imagine a world where we could support men to feel like really connected to themselves, really connected to their families, their communities. Like, we need strong men in society. We need men who are connected. We need men who are leaders, who are tender, who are in touch with their emotions. Men play such a pivotal role in society. And I think if we have stronger men, we have stronger families, we have stronger relationships, marriages. Yeah, I think there's just so much society can gain if we really focus on the experience of men in society and really trying to design a society where men feel on purpose, they feel like they're moving towards a goal, they feel supported by their family, by their community, by their partners. Yeah, I just think we need that. I've not experienced society like that. From my own experience growing up with my dad, he was disconnected from his feelings. He experienced deep trauma as a young person, as a child. He numbed his emotions with alcohol, instead of experiencing them, feeling them, disconnected. And he raised, a man in me until very recently I felt so lost in life. I didn't know what my purpose was. I didn't know why I was here. I didn't know how to move into my emotions, how to feel them. I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. I felt guilty for feeling certain things, and I still do. It's a process I'm moving through. Um, but I look back and think, what if that little boy, me, and that other little boy, Kieran, had a dad who was connected to himself, connected to his emotions, knew how to communicate without lashing out, without feeling overwhelmed by his emotions. Because that was my dad's, way of coping with his emotions. He'd either lash out at us or he'd drink. There was no responsibility he took because no one told him how to take responsibility. No one taught him. He was just following what his dad did, and his dad beat his mom, beat him, and beat my dad and his brothers. There's just this lack of responsibility that my dad was taught how to take for his emotions, and the impact he had on me, my brother. Yeah, it's something we've been working. Well, I've been working with well into adulthood. Kieran obviously struggled with, um, and I see that playing out again and again in the men's groups I'm part of, the men's communities I'm part of. fathers that just didn't know how to meet their sons. So yeah, again, this is a project about, that real extreme end of the spectrum where men are ending their lives. But what I'm really curious about as well is men further up that spectrum. You know, how can we support men who are living those lives of quiet desperation, going through the motions, going to work, you know, using alcohol to numb, using drugs to numb, using porn to numb, scrolling for days and days on their phone, and just not knowing how to go towards these more tender parts of themselves, these softer parts of themselves, these parts of themselves, they've been carrying and they don't know how to love, these parts they're ashamed of. Um, yeah. So that's what I'm curious to just explore. And as I say, I've got my first interview on Thursday. Really excited to go into that some more and just see where the project takes me. Again, I'm just, someone who's been very fixed in my life. I've got an idea and it has to happen. Whereas in this, I'm really trying to train myself to just trust that I can surrender, give away control, speak to people, let their wisdom infuse in me, let it all melt together and to co-create something magnificent. And I don't know what that's going to be, but I'm excited. So thank you for listening. I'm going to try and do these every week. And yeah, thank you. Take care. Lots of love.